passar pelo ribeiro, onde às vezes fitou-me alguém com
Yes, good evening to everybody. I'm Franco Bianchini. I'm one of the associate directors of the Center for Cultural Value, which is based at the University of Leeds in Yorkshire, in the north of England. I'm here to introduce this conversation with Professor Arjo Klamer, who will introduce himself. But Professor Klamer is the author of a number of important books and papers, including the recent book, Doing the Right Thing, which is proposing a value-based approach to the economy. Professor Klamer is an economist. I am by training a political scientist, but I have worked in different fields because, of course, the study of culture, cultural management, cultural policy, it's by its nature interdisciplinary. So I have worked in cultural management, but also collaborated closely with city planners, architects, and also sociologists, particularly urban sociologists. So the conversation today is about the value of culture beyond money, which is something that probably still needs to be restated because there is still a prevailing orthodoxy that perhaps the most important impact of cultural activities and cultural life is economic, although this is rapidly changing in the same way as the notion, for example, of the contribution of culture to urban regeneration is changing. There is now a growing awareness that the contribution of cultural activities to cities goes beyond tourism, beyond attracting inward investment, beyond the generation of jobs and wealth. But it also has to do with things like making friends, social capital, feeling better, well-being and health, both physical and mental health and well-being. So these are probably some of the themes that we are going to talk about with Professor Klamer. We will structure this conversation in three parts, starting from where these ideas of a wider notion of cultural value have come from, particularly in Professor Klamer's work and in my work as well. And then we continue with a discussion of the present. So in a way, the most important challenges and issues that we face today, in order perhaps also to change policy. And then the future, and we are now at a very interesting time, a time of incredible uncertainty and a time also potentially of exciting transformation, of perhaps time for a new policy settlement related to the devastating impacts of the pandemic, particularly in the fields that we are talking about, so culture, the cultural and creative industries, but also tourism. So perhaps we will start with a question to Professor Klamer. So you have started writing and questioning the economic orthodoxies already in the early 1980s, and where does the motivation to challenge these economic orthodoxies, particularly around the notion of value, where did it come from? How did you start? What was the sort of motivating force in the beginning of your career? And also, I would be grateful if you could introduce yourself a bit more fully than I have at the beginning. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, first, apology for all those watching that we are an hour late. Professors have always the right, I think, for an professorial hour, as we say, but it's not very polite, but we had trouble with getting our computer started. Anyway, I'm a cultural economist. I usually say so, although my appointment is really in a chair of the economics of art and culture. It was the first full chair, started in 1995. I came then from the United States, where I was an economist, taught economics, and at that time I was already interested in the connection between culture and economy. But it was really when I was applying for the chair, I thought I needed to think about a research subject. And I still remember exactly the place when I was walking on the way to my meeting with the committee, that what popped in my head was the value of culture. And only sort of by time I realized how loaded these concepts are. Because culture has different meanings, but so does value. And I have been working ever since with that. Because for an economist, the inclination is to equate value with price. And with culturalists, people who are interested in culture, it's just the other way around. They think value is something quite different from price. And when you look at art books, you will in vain look for the prices of paintings, but just will read about how wonderful and special those paintings are. So then it is all about cultural values, artistic values, historical values, and nothing to do with the price. It's always good to, at this moment, to call in mind the famous saying of Oscar Wilde, the economist is like the cynic who sees the price of everything and the value of nothing, and the romantic, the culturalist, is the one who sees the value of everything and the price of nothing. Now, for me, in the last 25 years, I have really preoccupied to see how I can do justice both through the economic perspective and the culturalist perspective. And that brought me, after many years and many discussions and many conversations with a lot of people in the field of cultural economics, Bruno Frey, David Crosby, and many others, Michael Crosby, Michael Hutter, that he realized that when we look at the arts, we need to broaden the perspective of economists. And that got me to look at the value-based approach. And I must say that I have learned a great deal from artists, actually. It's that at first I thought artists were stupid not to take to the logic of the market and to understand all the potential of markets and to understand how important the economy is. I got a great resistance from artists. I was even yelled at by artists who said that I was out of my mind and I didn't understand what they were doing. First, I thought they were stupid, but after a few years, I realized I was short-sighted. And so that changed my mind. I realized that artists had a point, that a lot of what they do is taking place outside the market, and even the market, the transactions, the pricing is not doing justice to what their art is all about. So that has been my program, basically, is to look for value beyond money, that money is actually, prices are only a limited set of values, and we should need not be entirely focused on that. We should actually more and more focus on what really matters, and these are, and Franco, you were already referring to that, all kinds of social values, as you pointed out, but also cultural values I would like to add. And they are important in and of themselves, but we can say more about it. I have been working with a lot of cities. I've been working also internationally, trying to sort of spread the message, so to say, that we look beyond the economy. It's sort of strange to have that come from an economist, but I would, and that's what I would like to express this conversation. The economy is merely instrumental. Sometimes it looks like it's what life is all about, but in reality, that's never the case. Economy is merely instrumental, and the substance is the social and the cultural life that you and I have. And that is what makes our life really valuable. So the economy only produces the instruments that we need to realize a good social and cultural life. So in the end, culture is far more important than the entire economy. You wouldn't say so sometimes, but I think that in most of our lives, the culture, I call that the sense-making activities, is so critical for our lives, for having good life. So it is so important to pay attention to it, so as we do in this conference.
Yeah, thank you, Arjo. You said you have learned a lot from artists, and I think that was also the inspiration from my work, I would say. I was particularly interested in the way artists themselves have changed since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, since the Enlightenment, really. I was aware of the idea of the artist in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, where there was really no clear distinction between the artist, the inventor, the scientist, and the architect, the urban planner. If we think, for instance, of Leonardo in Italy, or indeed Giorgio Vasari, who was a writer as well as an architect and a painter, so then something happened. I think from after the Enlightenment, where art itself became a specialization in a way, something which was separated in a way from the economy. And particularly in the Romantic period, there was this idea that the artist was somebody who was in danger of being contaminated by contact with the world of commerce and the industry and the economy. So I think, in a way, a lot of my work has been about trying to bring the idea of the artist and art back into everyday life, not keeping it as a sort of decoration, as a specialist activity, but something that has to be integrated into mainstream policy and planning. For example, I was very influenced by Patrick Geddes, who was a Scottish town planner, but he was also a sociologist who studied with Comte in Paris, a geographer. He studied with Reclus, and also a botanist. So very much a polymath, a product of the Scottish education system in many ways. And he was the first person, probably one of the first people, together with Camillo Sitte in Austria at the end of the 19th century, to talk about a new integrated approach which was bringing the arts into policy, treating it with equal dignity as economic policy or urban planning and so on. So I think we haven't made, sufficient progress in doing this, and I think there is still a hierarchy of values where the arts are seen as a soft subject. For example, the way education policy is changing in many countries, there is a sort of hierarchy which somehow deprioritizes creative subjects, art subjects, and it seems they are less important than science, technology, or mathematics. Are you hopeful that this might change, that we could see a change of values in relation also to the importance that we give to creative subjects in education?
This brings us to a subject that preoccupies me now, and to understand the role of the arts in the culture in general. And culture, I perceive as basically all sense-making activity. So you're Italian, you are trying to make sense of yourself as an Italian working in England. I am sort of worked in the United States, who is now living his life in the Netherlands. We study economics, art, culture, policy, and that's all sense-making activity. All people are engaged in sense-making activity. And the arts contribute in some way or another. But here I become critical, because, and I think also there's a reason. I mean, you go back to the Renaissance, and there artists had a real role in churches, and they had to imagine what faith was all about, to create images that people could connect to, that could inspire them. You adorned squares. That was quite integrated. It's unbelievable what you think, especially in Italian cities, what kind of beauty was generated. And it means also from Politicians at the time were aware of the need of bringing all this, at that moment, still craftsmanship in, and to adorn the cities and to make them beautiful in some way. Now, nowadays, that role of artists is not so clear. And that has something to do with the way art has developed into a more academic discipline. You could make a similar argument for the sciences, that has more and more sort of estranged itself from what I would call the public sphere, where you participate in sort of public activities, practices, to add meaning to them. And what the arts really struggle with, and that is true for painting, for theater, music maybe less so, but to be part in a way of this public sphere, so that people use art or need art to give expression to what's going on. Now I must say that arts does have that influence, but not so concretely and not so powerfully, I think, as is possible. So my critique is also that also artists could think about what their art is good for. And that's what I also see in your work, right? I have been very critical when politicians, and I was immediately critical, when politicians said art is good for the economy. So art has an economic impact, or should have an economic impact, and only that impact justifies us giving subsidies to the arts. So for a long time, and still, people argue that arts are important for jobs, for bringing in income, for tourism. Certainly in Asian countries, that's actually all they can think of, that they need art in order to attract tourism. And all what they see is yen or yuans or dollars or whatever hanging there, and that they think that they need the arts to do so. Also in the whole sort of regeneration argument, that art is seen as an instrument to regenerate urban cities. So art becomes an instrument. Now, I think that is a twisted way of thinking. And I think that because art's main task, if you ask me, but not many artists would join me, but the purpose of art is to add meanings of all kinds to our life, to get us to sort of see things maybe differently, to see things maybe in their contrast, in how beautiful they are, how meaningful, maybe also the transcendental is shown, but also the hope and the faith that art can give us. But it is more in the sense of meanings, and that discussion I find lacking. Also in policy discussions, I find that there is too much emphasis on economic impact. Now that fortunately is sort of tapering off, but now what is really the main emphasis in many policy discussions are the social impacts. And they think that art should serve public values, at least in the Netherlands. We cite Michael Moore as a tremendous impact, this Harvard professor, with his argument about public values, but that's usually translated into social values. So art should serve to improve diversity, improve inclusion, to include all kinds of groups of people, immigrants, young people, elder people, that they all should be included, and art has that function. Now, it has that function, but that is not what art in the end is about. And that's where I become critical, because it can be very distracting. The economists use the term crowding out, that if you emphasize too much these instrumental values, economic values, social values, that crowds out what the real values of arts are, and they are cultural values. That's what I learned from the artists and other culturalists, as I call them, that these cultural values are important in and of themselves.
Yeah.
And we should do justice to them. And by focusing too much on the instrumental part of art, we lose sight of what art really is about.
Yeah.
And that is to add meaning to our life.
Okay. Yes, well, I agree with you. And I would add that as part of this contribution of the arts to social value, what you call social value, now there are also arguments around the role of arts activities, cultural activities in improving health. So, for example, mental health, by encouraging people to make friends, by participating in cultural activities, physical also health, by, for example, doing cultural activities like dance or theater that also have a component of movement.
Yeah. You're right. You're right.
Yeah, and then there is even arguments about the importance of arts activities to counteract criminal behavior. For example, lots of really interesting projects in Brazil, in Venezuela, in Colombia, in Italy, in the area of Naples, where they argue that you can offer young people an alternative to the criminal as a model of behavior. In the same way as people were saying that through boxing or through encouraging people to participate in sport, you could take young people away from criminal activities. So all of this, as what you call the instrumental arguments for the arts, which are at one level economic arguments about job creation, attracting tourists, improving the attractiveness of cities, therefore attracting inward investment, raising the value of land and property and buildings, the economic arguments, and now the social arguments. They are both instrumental arguments. So just two questions for discussion there. One is that several artists I've met, they say, okay, let's accept these instrumental arguments. The important thing is that we get some funding, some support, because we can play the game, but then by being able to produce art, we will still produce meaning, and we will engage people with complex, difficult ideas. So we can accept these instrumental arguments, but twist them, in a sense, play the game to do what we want to do anyway. So they don't see the instrumentality, they don't think that stops them from producing the kind of art that makes people think. And then the second question is why? Why is the non-instrumental argument, which I agree with you, this is fundamentally the function of art, is to encourage us, to enable us to understand complexity, to understand the nuances, the complexity of human behavior, the complexity of the world, and to make us think. So if that is indeed the key function of art, why are very few politicians in favor of giving money to arts on the basis of that argument? Is it ultimately because they think that art is destabilizing? It is something that might encourage rebellious behavior, that perhaps they don't want maybe people to be too sophisticated, to think too much, because they do, they would perhaps see through some of the ideological narratives used by politicians that are ultimately simplifying narratives. So they are the opposite of art. While art is showing us complexity, a lot of political discourse tries to simplify things and to some extent to con people, to almost like trick people. So I don't know. I'm just a couple of thoughts from what you said.
What I notice, and of course I have been in discussions with politicians a lot, quite a few politicians are caught up in what I call transactional thinking. Mm-hmm. They think in terms of transactions, quid pro quo, and market transaction, prices, and so on, products. And so that's what gets them to think about what is, when you ask what's art good for, they think to generate transactions. Think about transactions that bring about jobs, that bring about income. That's what they're inclined to think of. And I understand that artists play that game. I do that too. When I get money, I play the transaction game. But it is very risky that it's a transaction game because the transaction game has no other objective than getting certain results. And art is about more than that. It's about these values that we are talking about. And they don't come about in these transactions. So I am arguing and trying to convince politicians to change their mind about that. And so I think it's important to get other concepts into the discussion. What I think it's great potential is a concept that many people are working with, and me too, is the idea to understand that art is an activity, a practice, and that it's a practice that is shared by a lot of people. We call them, therefore, common practices. They are shared. They have a community of people being involved in this practice. They participate and contribute. And then I point out that strong cities, cities that stand out, that are attractive, where people people are interested in. In my own country, it would be Amsterdam, it is Barcelona, it's New York, of course, is always characterized by very strong practices. And what does that mean? That there are all kinds of institutions, all kinds of people, all kinds of groups, communities active to participate and contribute to these practices. As a government, you can provide the conditions of these practices, but it is people that generate these practices. So governments are not all powerful in this. They have to support, facilitate, but even that is not sufficient. There also have to be some luck that people will be attracted and gather in these places and create all these activities. And for that, you need also artists who are weird, do things that might be offensive, because that also generates a lot of activity. So my argument with politicians is that they are interested and should be interested in the quality of these cultural practices, these common practices, and that they also have to understand that requires a lot of collaboration, a lot of social activity in order for it to generate. I live myself in a provincial town, and there is really no chance that you will have serious theater, modern dance. It is just too small, because people like me go to the city, Amsterdam in my case, to be part of that and to contribute to that. Because the common practices there are highly developed. Lots of people involved, and that attracts people also from my town to go there. So my argument to politicians is pay attention and chart these common practices and try to figure out what is lacking. And then understand that it's not a matter of setting up buildings or throwing money at one organization or another, but you have to figure out, and that sometimes requires quite sort of a varied approach, including all kinds of social initiative, to generate and stimulate these practices. Now, that's a skill that at this moment governments don't have. And I'm working with all kinds of groups, including developers and architects, how they can take into account these common practices and that they can build and develop in such a way that they stimulate the flourishing of these common practices. And I think that's where the discussion should be. So away from products, institutions, organizations, towards these common practices. And that gives a whole new twist and dimension to policy discussions, and I have some good examples, and they are usually involved that politicians themselves, but also civil servants, are actively involved. In Rotterdam, we had Rotterdam invested a great deal has been investing a great deal in culture in the last 20 years, but the success had a great deal to do with a few civil servants. I think actually one in particular. That guy was everywhere. He knew everyone. So if you wanted to do something in photography in Rotterdam, you ask Hugo, his name, have to see what's going on, to get connected with other people doing the same. A guy like that was crucial for the development of common practices. Of course, it cannot be measured. There are no indicators, no results to document that. A student of mine has done a study with big data, and that actually does pretty good, is a pretty good way of capturing the quality of these common practices, I find. And that gives also signals, I think, to politicians and others how you can strengthen and support these practices, but an entirely different approach, which in a way I also think is similar to what you are doing in your Center on Cultural Values, because that's what we are talking about. I think that what you and I share is both an interest in how you realize values beyond the market. So not just because I think that's the same what you and I are doing. You focus more on these mental health issue, on criminality, and I agree with you that art contributes to what I would call civilization. And that also means issues that you are then bringing up. But I would go a little bit further and also say that art contributes to what I would call sense-making. And let me conclude making another point we often forget. These common practices are critical for people who like to dance to be able to dance, for people who like to make music to be able to make music, for people who like to paint to be able to make paint or to make performance pieces. Artists, the makers, are entirely dependent on the quality of those commons. And that includes them. They usually are the core of these commons. But it requires that all kinds of people interested, participating, willing to contribute, but also willing to pay. And that's where you find that in a city as New York, there's so much energy, but it involves so many people who are willing to participate, contribute, and also pay, finance, support, that it is an inspiring place to work. Now, if you keep that in mind, you understand that whatever city you are thinking of, the question is, what is the quality of the common practices, what is lacking, and what we could do. And again, then the makers are usually playing a crucial role in this. And that's what I also would like to stress. The more people are stimulated to participate in it and also to make art, the more rich and stronger and interesting places are.
Okay, thanks. So I think before we take some questions or comments from people listening, watching, let's talk a little bit about the future. Obviously, the future is shaped by the coronavirus pandemic. It's impossible to predict exactly what's going to happen. The only thing where I think there is a consensus is that the effects, particularly the economic effects of the pandemic, are fairly structural. So we are likely to see transformations which probably will last at least for the next 5 or 10 years. So it's not going to be something very short term. But I think, in my view, in relation to the possibility of changing our attitudes to art, particularly political attitudes and attitudes in policy terms, I think what's going to happen really very much depends on what kind of ideological, what kind of political ideology is going to emerge out of the pandemic. Obviously, it will not be one. Perhaps it will be a combination of different things. But there are different views among futurologists. There are people who say that we are going to come out of this probably with a strengthening of authoritarian systems, with therefore not very good news in terms of the kind of ideas that we are interested in. So systems which are going to have more pervasive surveillance, censorship, and erosion of privacy, a crisis of independent arts in a way, and perhaps a crisis also of independent journalism and statistics, and perhaps an economic response to the coronavirus crisis, which is going to focus on things like environmental deregulation in order to create jobs more quickly, because there's going to be a substantial unemployment crisis produced by this. And the people who talk about this scenario also say that it is likely there will be a very contested scenario with continuous battles between social movements that are advocating climate emergency and race equality conflicting with politicians. Then there are other people, other futurologists who are basically saying that we are going to move towards much more fragmented societies, and particularly for culture, there's going to be less public money for cultural activities. A lot of cultural organizations are going to close down, but at the same time, culture will not die, cultural life will not die. It will be supported by new networks of mutuality, particularly at neighborhood level, much more localized culture, a relaunch of what we call at the moment as amateur arts, and a much stronger interest in local tourism, almost like tourism of local residents, with a rediscovery, if you like, of our own cities. And finally, there are more optimistic people who are saying that out of the pandemic, perhaps a new post-pandemic settlement will emerge with a shorter working week, with much stronger global cooperation, and a kind of utopia, but perhaps a practical utopia, a bit similar to what Rebecca Solnit talked about in a book called A Paradise Built in Hell, which was published in 2009. So we don't really know what's going to happen. But what's your view? How is the pandemic impacting on the likelihood of your ideas about the value of culture being implemented in a way, becoming part of public policy?
I see. The most impact that this virus crisis has is on the form, the way art is presented. Mm-hmm. And of course, especially live performances, where we share the experience with others, which can be quite powerful. They are at the moment very difficult or even impossible. But that doesn't mean that we, you and I, and people in general, don't have this need of a sense of meaning, to have a reflection on what it all means. As you are already sort of addressing and bringing up a lot of issues, I think that everyone is searching of it, and also is being confronted with the possibility that the human race maybe has an end to it. What does that mean? How? So I think that there are some fundamental issues come up, and I think that artists, the art makers, can really are needed to give expression to that. That's their skill, that's their art, that's their work, to give expression to all the things that we maybe unconsciously be thinking of, or we had the issues or the perspectives that we are in need of. So I think if any time art has an urgency, it would be now. So that's the discussion I have with artists. And let's face it, people who write books are very much okay, because we are reading probably more books than ever. Yes. But also movie makers, maybe. if they don't take too many people in their movie, because we're watching a lot on the screen. So there are possibilities to reach people, only in different ways. Live performances are difficult, but that doesn't prevent us from finding other ways to sharing these meanings. Because again, it is about generating these common practices. The coronavirus has affected the common practices. Have really taken out a great deal of quality out of these common practices in the sense of having these meetings. But that's also the challenge ahead, is how, and there I trust that artists are resilient, are creative, are imaginative, are entrepreneurial, to think of other ways to feed and to fill these common practices that you and I are in need of to make sense of what's going on here, to be inspired, to be shocked, to be reflect, to make us reflect, to give us images that we can hold on to, that gives some direction to our life. I think that's the real assignment to art makers now, and I see a lot of picking this up. For at least the artists I talk find this indeed a time that they are inspired to think differently about what they do. So in that sense, I'm quite hopeful. I think there's a lot of power in the arts world. And in some way, but maybe that's an illusion, but in some way I think this period could do the arts good. Because because in some way the practice became still, too predictable, the institutions were too firmly established. Maybe there's a time for change, for experiments, and that also might bring new energy into these common practices. So that's my hope. It's hope, I must say, because we don't know how long this is going to last, and a lot of institutions, and I talk with a great deal of them, are really in trouble. A lot of artists who are self-employed are really struggling. Actors don't know what to do, thinking that they have to change their profession. I mean, there's a lot of despair, so let's not neglect that. But amidst all this disastrous terrain of lost souls and people who are wondering what in the hell they can do, I see also all kinds of initiatives sprouting up, all kinds of attempts to find new forms. So I put my hope in those. And I like to participate in activities like that. And I also support them, also financially, to make it happen. And that's also another issue. I think that these initiatives, usually, certainly in my country, everyone looks for the government. But I think we should look more at the people to support these kind of activities, that we become aware that art is important in our life, and that therefore we also should appreciate artists doing their work. And so I'm always advocating that it is more, that art requires contributions, and contributions can also come in financial forms. So if you care about art, also give to the arts. If you care about artists, give to the artists and make their work possible. So I'm part of all kinds of initiatives to set up foundations, funds that also enable artists to do their work. So I see possibilities. At the same time, I also see, just like you, and you named up a lot of issues that sort of threaten us and overwhelm us. But that's what art is about, is sort of to see how we can have a way out. And sort of also, I think art sometimes points up and make us see things that we otherwise would not be aware of.
Good. Yeah, thanks. Let's see. I think we have another 10-15 minutes for possible comments or questions, if there are any. I
don't think that there are possibilities to ask questions, actually.
No, there was a chat here that I thought there was people can use, if I'm not mistaken, but there isn't at the moment anything there. Yeah. It is not possible to ask questions. Yes. Okay, fine. Well, in that case, we have perhaps we have a little bit of time.
We need to finish, Franco.
We need to finish now, yeah?
Yeah, we should finish, yeah.
Okay, good. So I'm not sure whether we still have about 5 minutes, or perhaps the organizers can tell us if we still.
No, we should finish. We should finish
now. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, in that case, I just wanted to thank the festival for the invitation to both of us, on behalf of both of us. Again, like Professor Klamer said at the beginning, sorry for some technological problems that delayed the start for this conversation, and I hope it was useful. And thanks to Professor Klamer for participating. And please get in touch if there are other questions. I am contactable through the Center for Cultural Value in Leeds, and Professor Klamer is also contactable easily. So thank you, and enjoy the rest of the festival.
Quando me laças